Mr. Cobb, thanks so much for taking the time. I appreciate it.
My pleasure to be with you, Dimitri. Thanks for having me.
Want to talk about your career a bit. Your career took the path that many lawyers' careers take. You were a prosecutor first, went into private practice. At some point into your career in private practice, you joined the Trump administration in connection with the Mueller investigation, right? How'd that happen?
Well, I've had a couple of other interruptions to my private practice. I was a independent counsel, senior trial counsel at the independent counsel in the HUD investigation, and public service was something that had always appealed to me. I have to say I didn't look for the Trump assignment. I was asked to take it. It was a difficult decision because I was politically not a supporter, but at the same time, I was concerned based on what I'd been told by people I trusted who were closer to the facts than me, that there were some significant issues here in connection with the Russian investigation that appeared to suggest that it was not what it was purported to be by the New York Times and the Washington Post, and that somebody had to navigate that course with Bob Mueller. Bob Mueller is somebody I had known and respected since 1983, and when we were both prosecutors, him in Massachusetts and me in Maryland. So I thought long and hard and stepped down from my partnership at Hogan and became a full-time government employee again after 30 years.
Now, you had noted that the investigation was not a witch hunt in your view, but should have moved faster. Why?
Well, so what we know is the origins of it actually, justify the witch hunt, justify in some quarters anyway, the witch hunt characterization. As the CIA director told President Obama and others in the Oval Office in July of 2015 or 16, I'm sorry. They had information that Hillary had started a false flag operation and had paid lawyers and others to promote it. And that information got as far as Peter Strzok and died in the files of the FBI. That never made it into any FISA applications. Other things in FISA applications, were, as Mike Horowitz, who I respect greatly as well, who is as liberal as the day is long, but is as honest as the day is long as well, candidly came out in his findings with regard to Strzok and McCabe and others that the FISA process had been deeply corrupted and referred McCabe and Strzok and others for criminal prosecution. Once I dug into the facts at the White House, which took a while, frankly, it became pretty clear to me that cooperation was better than fighting tooth and nail and having a bunch of drawn out court proceedings, all of which would have eviscerated executive privilege. As it turned out, the way we managed it by cooperating, never had a subpoena, never had a court fight, never really had a stern conversation with the principal people that I was dealing with. We were able to get to the end of the line, but we were at the end of the line factually in January of 2018, and it took them another 14 or 15 months before they agreed to tell the world that there was no there on Russia, and I think that was unfortunate. I think it reflected the views of a couple of people on Mueller's team that they wanted to. They were more interested in Trump than they were in the benefit of the United States. But they prevailed on that, but ultimately reached a conclusion that was required by the facts, which was there had been no active involvement by Trump or anybody in his administration with any Russians in connection with the campaign.
How do you look back at your time at the White House?
So I'm not much for looking back. So it's an odd lens for me. Um, as somebody who was not a big Trump supporter, it was challenging every day because I was surrounded by a lot of people who were, and then then there were a lot of people who, like me, were there basically to try to serve their country and do the best job they could to, help the country through difficult times as the divisiveness between the parties and the classes and the races and every place else, began to smolder. There were those of us who were trying very hard to keep the press honest and to get the facts out and hope that the country could survive that exercise, just like what people are dealing with now. It started then, but it's not over, and it seems to get worse every day.
Let's talk about some of these indictments. There is an idea by some that some or all of these indictments are political prosecutions, quote unquote. Nobody really knows what that phrase means, at least not fully. How dangerous is it that the country even operates under a perception, let's say, that some of these may be influenced by politics, that prosecutorial discretion is impacted by politics? How bad does that look?
So I think it's very serious for the country. And it's something that, justice at all levels needs to be careful of. I differ with most of what the former Attorney General Bill Barr has said in terms of the decision to actually prosecute Trump. I think the way he managed the classified information case probably tipped the scales in favor of prosecution in connection with both his cases, because there was such flagrant disregard for the norms and such criminal activity ongoing to try to obstruct that case. I think the former Attorney General has described it as non-jurisprudential. I understand that criticism, and there is that third world country line of cannibalizing your former leaders. But I think in this case, what Trump did shook the country at its core and was a direct assault on multiple constitutional protections that have kept us a republic for 250 years. So I'm content certainly with the Jack Smith prosecutions. I think the Georgia case is a bit of an overreach, but certainly there is evidence there to prosecute certain crimes, whether it is the broad RICO conspiracy between the hip hop world and Trump and everybody included in that indictment, I guess will remain to be seen. I do think that the case in New York, though, sadly, added fuel to the fire in terms of the political prosecution arguments. I think that's a very difficult case to justify, particularly when the prosecutor ran on the promise that he would take on Trump. I think that's a dangerous intersection for the country where the potential for the abuse of the rule of law is seen and real. So I'm not surprised that Trump is making these arguments. On the other hand, these are the types of arguments that he's made his whole life. He's a victim. Everybody else is out to get him. The checklist of narcissistic objections to anything that doesn't go his way.
When he was indicted in New York, right, there became an obvious argument, kind of one that you just laid out, that the prosecutor ran on a certain promise, right? The electorate that had put him into office comprised, at least in theory, the jury pool that will now preside over the trial. How problematic is that? It seems, at least when you discuss it and lay it out the way I just did, it's a big deal.
So I agree with you on that. I think the system will save us ultimately in that case. I don't think the New York Court of Appeals, courts of appeal, and maybe perhaps ultimately the Supreme Court in that particular case, should it ever go forward, and it's certainly not going to go forward before the election, So if Trump wins, it would have to be, likely 4 years later. If he loses, it can go forward in 2025. But I think in the New York case, they so contorted the law that I'm not sure a conviction survives.
Defendants are rare to waive a jury. In this particular case, assuming it gets that far, that seems to be something that at least should be explored. What's your take on that?
So I think that's a good consideration in that particular case. I think it's very if you look at the demographics in the jury pool and Trump's favorability ratings in the jury pool, I think that that's a worthwhile consideration. On the other hand, if I'm a criminal defense lawyer in that case, I have to weigh the issue of I might be able to get more defense information and more arguments and more witnesses in front of a jury than I might with a judge, and make my complete record. But I would seriously consider waiving a jury trial in the New York case.
No, in Georgia, when the indictment came down, so many lawyers were struck because several lawyers were indicted, right? And in this country, there is an encouragement, whether it's by the rules of ethics or otherwise, for lawyers to put forth creative legal arguments. Is what happened in Georgia a problem? Is it an anomaly? Or is it just kind of the stars lining up in a case that's high profile, where several lawyers were indicted? And I know some have taken pleas and some haven't. How do you view that?
So it's an anomaly, but it's an anomaly in the same way that Trump is an anomaly. I mean, if you look at Trump, he's had unethical lawyers most of his, professional career, starting with Roy Cohn, Michael Cohen, some pretty obvious examples. I think, sadly, his power to, corrupt people is beat with power or promises of favoritism is much stronger than you would wish it could possibly be in a country that we were led to believe was based on principle and the rule of law. But I think sadly the frivolous nature of the claims and the clear-cut effort to violate the laws, obstructive congressional proceeding, and take actions with fake electors, et cetera, the wide-ranging misconduct, and much of it led by lawyers. So I think it's an anomaly, but we've seen lawyers indicted in cases many times. There are thousands of doctor lawyer cases, conspiracies where lawyers and doctors team up to defraud insurance companies, and so I mean there are a lot of lawyers walking around the prison camps of the United States. They shouldn't be a protected class, as my family reminds me every day.
There's an issue now with one lawyer in particular, Rudy Giuliani, and his defamation case. This is a case where it seems attorney-client privilege, assuming it's not defeated by one of the exceptions that seemingly it will be defeated by, will be threatened should these proceedings go further. He was already found liable. Now there seems to be another version of that lawsuit coming forward based on other statements that he's made. How do you view that case turning around?
So, so on the defamation case, I don't think that the attorney-client privilege intrudes. And it was not a consequential factor in the initial trial, in large part because Giuliani didn't provide any discovery. They issued judgment against him. It was really only about damages. And then he had the misstep of, at the end of the first day of trial of, going in front of the cameras and saying that everything he'd said previously was true, which may earn him, yet another defamation charge. So I think in that aspect, probably doesn't come to come to a judgment in terms of the lawyer-client privilege. But certainly in the Jack Smith cases, the crime fraud exception has been front and center. Take the Florida case where Evan Corcoran was directed by Trump to provide an affidavit or arrange an affidavit, which he did based on Trump's assurance that there were no responsive documents, even though he's on film with his co-defendant or his co-defendants are on film, moving boxes and orchestrating, the obstruction. So I think the issues there are highly unique. The issues in the constitutional cases, I call it the January 6th case, are even more complex when it comes to attorney relationships, both in the Jack Smith context and certainly in the Fani Willis context. But in the Fani Willis case, two of those lawyers have already pled guilty. So that gives her a leg up in terms of demonstrating, crime fraud.
The real interesting question as it relates to kind of all these cases, it seems, is that as we get further into this year, right, as the trial judges feel a need to push these cases to trial, we may end up with a possibility that a trial is ongoing or at least going to take place in the near future, and the candidate is either running in the general election or something of that sort. How do you anticipate the law sorting out what is not only unique, but will likely never happen again? What do you think will happen with that general kind of scenario?
I think for the most part that it's important that the appellate courts hold the line on the no man is above the law principle in our country. I think if Jeffrey Dahmer had gone to trial and filed to run for president, would they have delayed his trial? No. The Trump defenses, that he can hide and avoid trial merely because he's running for president, I don't think have any basis in the law, certainly not in the Constitution. There is a Justice Department policy, of course, that you try not to, crack the 90-day window. I think Jack Smith's trying, desperately and correctly to, get done before that. I think the likelihood is that, the Jack Smith case, does go to trial and does go to trial before the 90-day window, and that Trump would be likely convicted before the 90-day window, although that's probably 65-35 at this stage of the game. I know a lot of people say it's 50-50. 50-50 is, as far as I'm concerned, that's guessing. But 65-35, I think there's a good chance that this case gets to trial. I don't think the DC Circuit's going to have any difficulty, and I should disclose I'm on an amicus brief countering the immunity arguments that Trump made. But I don't think the DC Circuit is going to have any difficulty finding that Trump has no criminal immunity, that there is no such thing. And they're not going to find for him on double jeopardy because, I know, actually you have to have been in jeopardy to have double jeopardy, and he wasn't in the impeachment process. So, but I think it's essential that the courts move expeditiously. They're capable of doing it. They seem to be taking it seriously. I don't think, the short delay that the Supreme Court has introduced by, saying, well, why don't we wait 2 weeks until the DC Circuit hears this? I don't think that actually is the victory that Trump thinks it is. And I think they had that it could provide them the option of, not having to consider it at all, depending on the force and effect of the DC Circuit opinion.
So many folks are saying that all these indictments are helping him politically, right? Boosting his popularity. Obviously, look, we would like prosecutors not to take that kind of thing into consideration. Do you view that as a problem?
Well, I view them taking that into consideration as a problem. And, I think it just elevates him as a bully if he's able to, get away with that argument. I think the justice was designed to be blind, and the Justice Department should be the Justice Department, not the, how will this look department. I think the likelihood of Trump, going to jail in advance, if he won the election, the likelihood of him going to jail in advance of that is nil. If he wins the election, he can have both of the Jack Smith cases dismissed by somebody at the Justice Department appointed by him. This talk about this 3-year talk about him, pardoning himself is sort of a silly tangent because he doesn't have to resort to that. He'll be able to have it dismissed. And then you have the 2 state cases, which, if they haven't gotten to trial, nobody knows. There is no law or even policy on the issue of, can a president be criminally tried in a state for state crimes while he's a sitting president. The Justice Department position is he can't be tried for a criminal case by the Justice Department during the time he serves because of the importance of the position. But that's just a policy. That's not the law. And I think people, forget that. But the likelihood is, they'll either say he can be tried or he can't be tried, or he can be tried only after he serves his term or is impeached.
What will come of Trump's removal from the Colorado Maine ballots?
So that's an interesting case. So I was once an advocate during the January 6th proceedings of Congress, going farther and, making the findings, required by, arguably required by Section 3 of the 14th Amendment, to find that he, was guilty of insurrection and should be disqualified. But they didn't go that route. That was one of their recommendations to Congress. But Pelosi wanted to keep Trump around for the election, and basically killed any chance to have that exit ramp, which I think is, there's a lot of politics going on both sides here. But I don't think there's any doubt that the Supreme Court will find in Trump's favor, sadly, on the Article 3 issue, both as a matter, well, primarily, I think they're likely to go 8-1 or 7-2 at the most against the government on the issue of, against the Colorado and Maine governments, on the issue that Article 3 doesn't apply to the president or the vice president, neither of whom are mentioned in Article 3. And certainly the due process issue is one that scholarship and case law would suggest does not favor either state.
I want to talk about free speech a bit.
Great.
Is there a First Amendment defense to the January 6th allegations?
No. So it's interesting. Trump has admitted, actually, in many of his speeches, well, not in many speeches, in many of the proceedings, at least 2 of the proceedings, that he was acting as a candidate. So then you're into political speech, and political speech, gets weighed a little differently. It gets intense protections, but at the same time, it doesn't author, as Nadine, I know, Nadine Strassen, who you've interviewed previously and former head of the ACLU, has always said that if there's an emergency, if there's a threat, that free speech gets stopped at that door. And once people start getting shot and dying on Capitol Hill, and you sit in your office for 3 hours watching TV and send out a tweet about denigrating Mike Pence, I think that there's a compelling argument that there's no First Amendment protection for that.
Are there any viable First Amendment arguments in connection with the gag orders?
Oh, sure. Actually, there are. I think the courts have. Well, I think the district court in D.C. certainly rendered a very principled opinion, trying to draw the lines as narrowly as she felt were in the interest of justice. the DC Circuit refined it, only slightly, frankly. It's some of the press think they really scaled it back, but they really didn't. They expanded it to allow him to complain and whine about Jack Smith, but beyond that, nothing consequential. So yes, I mean, and the gag order is designed for a very important, principle in American law, which is, not contaminating the jury pool or allowing the intimidation of witnesses. So, in order to uphold principle, the gag orders are both appropriate and guided by the First Amendment in terms of the breadth of their application. But now we have a relatively narrow order that I'm sure Judge Chuckin will enforce effectively.
Every lawyer who represents a client under indictment or investigation worth his salt will tell his client to not talk to anybody, let alone the press, assuming that's a possibility. In this case, there are so many extrajudicial statements that have already been made. It doesn't seem like that is anywhere near a possibility for his lawyers to do. I am assuming they know that. How do you think that'll impact these cases going forward? Or will he somehow adjust his conduct moving forward as these cases get closer to trials?
That's a complicated question on an ethical level. Just because he's not going to take your advice doesn't mean you should withhold it.
Right.
And I think hopefully somebody will get his attention and tell him to stop talking, and if you're going to talk, stop lying, because you're just digging a hole. He won't listen, but they're obligated to tell him. Now, Trump's, cross-examination, with statement, if he ever testified, with statements that he previously made, it would be devastating. I don't think he can take the stand. I think he knows enough about the law at this stage of the game that, he recognizes he can't take the stand in the criminal cases. But should he, cross the Rubicon there, he'll get eviscerated.
The Fifth Amendment point is an interesting one, right? Because in his cases, forget about the criminal cases, there have been so many civil cases that he's been involved in, many of which he's been deposed in, he's given testimony in courtrooms in. How muddy is that Fifth Amendment question now? Obviously, as everybody knows, you're not entitled to the same protections in the civil case as you are in a criminal case. What happens moving forward? Are those Fifth Amendment protections, at least in practice, certainly not in theory, but in practice, gone?
So let's start with, Rule 403, Federal Rule of Evidence 403, and the hearsay exceptions. Trump has made a lot of admissions against his own interests. Those comments will walk in, okay, and not a Fifth Amendment issue, but those comments will walk in. On the other hand, the government, unlike in the civil cases, the government cannot, in a criminal case, call the defendant. So the effort, the issue of the Fifth Amendment is not as applicable in the criminal cases unless he attempts to testify and refuses to answer, certain questions. But if he attempts to testify and he answers some questions but not others, the law is, not crystal clear, but pretty clear that that's a waiver.
Yeah. I want to finish up by talking a bit about cameras in the courtroom. Obviously, in federal cases, that's not allowed. In the state cases, there are varying opinions as to whether or not cameras will be permitted here. Would having cameras in the courtroom be a good idea in this case or in these cases, I suppose?
No. My experience is, as a former prosecutor and as a criminal defense lawyer, that once you put cameras anywhere, people perform. All you have to do, the biggest argument, the easiest argument against cameras in the courtroom is Judge Ito from the OJ case. That was a circus because it was on TV. And what happens is everybody feels like they have to pontificate, they have to bloviate, it'll extend the trial, it'll tax the judge's patience. And it doesn't well serve justice because you've got a jury there. You're taxing them. They're there as a public service. And I've always thought the best justice is expeditious justice, and the delays that a camera introduce into a case, I think, are substantial. And I also think the ability of witnesses is to testify fully is hampered because these are not experienced actors or performers like lawyers can be, or like a politician can be. These are simple people coming forward because they are fulfilling their civic duty, or in many cases, in these cases, will be honoring plea agreements. So I am not a fan of cameras in the courtroom. I think one day that given the erosion of standards in the country, that it's likely that that'll happen. I hope before it does that there's some effort to deal with the objections that I've just raised.
Generally speaking, where do you see these cases going in the next year or so?
So I see, if I had a crystal ball and I had to make a prediction right now, I see the January 6th case going to trial before the election, and only the January 6th case going to trial before the election. I think it could start in as early as May, but certainly in June. I don't think it takes that long. The reality is the evidence is very straightforward, and Trump is scrambling, trying to introduce, Russian interference and a host of other things, but nobody's trying to defend his conduct. He doesn't have any witnesses who can defend his conduct because they're all testifying about what he did. And the cross-examinations, at the end of the day, they will demonstrate the fallibility of each witness and the fact that they accommodated Trump, but nobody's gonna claim they weren't acting at his admonition. So I think that that case could go very quickly, 6 weeks perhaps. I think Jack Smith has said 6 to 8 weeks, so that's a possibility. But I think that case is over by the end of August, and at that point he's convicted. But if he, again, as I say, if he wins, and he is ensconced in the Oval Office, he can have the cases dismissed by his Justice Department.
Well, Mr. Cobb, I appreciate your time and your insight. Thank you so much for doing this. I appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thank you, Dimitri. Nice to be on.